My name is Samuel Keaton. I am 79 years old, and every morning I wake up in the same creaking wooden bed where my wife and I slept for almost half a century. Though now her side has been empty for 9 years, the first thing I hear is the tired tick of the clock on the wall, a heavy antique thing that my father gave me when I retired from the post office. And though it has grown slower with age, it still counts the seconds more faithfully than my own children do. When I swing my legs off the bed, it takes me several minutes to straighten myself because my knees, swollen with arthritis, no longer respond as they once did. I shuffle toward the kitchen, touch the table with the palm of my hand as I pass, and then start the familiar ritual of making coffee in the percolator, the way my late wife, Marjorie, used to prepare it. I grind the beans too finely, I let the water boil too long, and I never quite manage the aroma she achieved, but still I perform it every morning because it is the only piece of routine that makes me feel she is not entirely gone. I stand at the window with a chipped cup warming my fingers, looking out at the empty street of my small Midwestern town, where the mailboxes are decorated with faded stickers of American flags, and where the lawns are carefully trimmed by men younger than me who do not wave when they see me anymore. I used to know everyone on this street, used to shovel their driveways in the winter and sit on porches in the summer evenings. But most of them are gone now, replaced by families who are too busy to notice an old man walking by. I have lived in this house since 1968, when Marjorie and I scraped together enough money for the down payment. Back then, the walls smelled of fresh paint and our hopes for the future. And when our daughter Eleanor was born, I planted a maple tree in the backyard, promising that it would grow with her. The tree is still there, tall and wide, shading most of the yard. But Eleanor no longer comes to sit beneath it. She is 50 now, married to a man named Craig, and they live in a large suburban house across town. They visit rarely, and when they do, the conversations feel less like family gatherings and more like business meetings, where I am expected to listen and nod while they explain what is best for me. My 2 grandchildren, Nicholas and Grace, are in their 20s, and though I remember teaching them how to ride bicycles and grilling hot dogs for them in the backyard, they no longer send Christmas cards or call on my birthday. When I think about them, it feels as if I am remembering characters from a book I once loved, but that no one else wants to read anymore. Despite the loneliness, I try to keep a semblance of dignity in my daily life. After coffee, I take a slow walk to the end of the block, leaning on my cane, and I stop at the small bench near the park entrance. I carry breadcrumbs in a paper bag and scatter them for the pigeons. Some mornings I sit there long enough to watch the school children go by, backpacks slung over their shoulders, laughing at jokes I can no longer hear. Sometimes one of them looks at me curiously, perhaps wondering who I am, but no one ever asks. When the weather is harsh, I stay inside, reading newspapers that pile up on the porch, working slowly through the crossword puzzle, even though my eyes blur after a few lines. I tell myself that these little activities keep me sharp, though I sometimes fear that sharpness is the last thing anyone around me wants me to maintain. The truth is, my body betrays me more often these days, and with every falter, I sense how people begin to look at me not as a man, but as a liability. Last winter I slipped on the ice in front of the grocery store, and though I managed to stand back up and wave away the concerned clerk, I saw the way his expression lingered, half pity, half irritation, as if I had delayed the world by falling. Since then, Eleanor has been more insistent that I cannot keep living alone. She says things like, "Dad, you shouldn't be by yourself in that drafty house. It's too much work for you." Or, "What if something happens and nobody finds you for days?" Her words are delivered with the softness of concern, but the undertone of authority, the kind children adopt when they no longer see their parents as capable. I never argue loudly because I know that old men who protest are called stubborn, while those who stay quiet are called reasonable. And somewhere between those labels, I try to preserve a fragment of my pride. Evenings are the hardest when the shadows stretch across the living room, and I sit in my recliner staring at the photographs on the mantel. There is one of Marjorie in her 40s, standing in the garden with her hands full of roses, smiling at me as if I had just told a joke. Another of Eleanor holding Nicholas as a baby, and one of Grace in her graduation gown, throwing her cap in the air while I clapped from the bleachers. These images are not just pictures, they are anchors holding me to a life that feels increasingly like it belongs to someone else. Sometimes I imagine conversations with them, speaking into the quiet house, as though my words might carry through the walls to wherever they are, but the silence that follows always reminds me of the distance. Still, I have learned to live with absence. I prepare simple meals, oatmeal with raisins, boiled potatoes, sometimes a roast chicken if I have the strength. I wash the dishes by hand, stacking them neatly on the rack. At night, I read the Bible or an old Western novel, though I rarely reach the end of a chapter before sleep takes me. It is not an unhappy existence, not entirely, but it is fragile, balanced on the edge of being forgotten. And I suspect that Eleanor has already decided that my independence is nothing but an inconvenience. What pains me most is that she speaks of care in the language of efficiency. She says things like, "It would be easier for everyone," or "They can monitor you better there," as though my life were a spreadsheet of costs and risks. Craig, her husband, is worse. He speaks rarely to me, but when he does, it is always about numbers. The value of the house, the expense of repairs, the cost of medical bills. He talks as if I am already gone, as if my existence is only the residue of finances to be managed. I sometimes wonder whether Eleanor echoes his thoughts because she truly believes them, or because she has grown tired of resisting him. Either way, it leaves me in the position of a spectator, watching my own family discuss my future, as if I were not in the room. I try not to be bitter, but bitterness grows in silence. On Sundays, I attend church, sitting in the third pew from the back, and I bow my head, not just for the sermon, but for the comfort of being in a place where people still say my name with respect. The pastor shakes my hand firmly, calls me Brother Keaton, and though he may not know the details of my life, in that moment, I feel less invisible. I linger after the service, chatting with whoever will stop long enough. But eventually the crowd disperses, and I return to the quiet house, where only the clock and the faint creak of the floorboards accompany me. In recent months, I have begun to sense that change is coming, though no one says it openly. Eleanor's visits have grown shorter, her glances sharper, as if she is measuring how much time I have left before decisions must be made. Once, while she thought I was dozing in the recliner, I overheard her whispering to Craig in the kitchen, saying, "He can't go on like this. It's irresponsible." The word irresponsible stung more than I expected. I wanted to rise, to tell her that I have managed fine, that I pay my bills, clean my house, remember my medicine, but I stayed quiet, because defending oneself too loudly only confirms their suspicion. So here I remain, an old man in a familiar house that has grown heavier with each passing year, clinging to routines that feel like the last threads of autonomy. I do not ask for much. I do not demand constant attention or extravagant gestures. I want only the dignity of being allowed to live my days in the place where my memories reside. Yet I can feel, in the hushed tones of conversations and the calculating looks exchanged over dinner tables, that my family has other plans, and though I cannot yet see the shape of what awaits me, I know that it is not freedom, but something that resembles confinement disguised as care. It was in late autumn, just as the air began to bite with the first hint of frost, and the daylight shortened so that evenings seemed to fall almost as soon as breakfast was over, that Eleanor arrived at my door with an energy that was both unfamiliar and unsettling. She wore a wool coat too fine for ordinary errands and carried herself with the brisk decisiveness of someone who had already made a decision before opening her mouth. Craig followed her, holding his phone, as though even in my presence his true attention belonged elsewhere, and though he smiled, it was the kind of smile people reserve for unwanted obligations. They entered without waiting for me to invite them, as if my house had ceased to be mine, and sat down at the kitchen table where Marjorie and I once spent long evenings talking about nothing and everything. "Dad," Eleanor began, her tone too bright, as though rehearsed, "we've been thinking it's time you had a change of scenery. You need more company, more activity. You've been alone here too long, and it's not healthy." I stirred my coffee slowly, feeling the familiar ache in my hand, and asked what she meant. She exchanged a quick glance with Craig before continuing, "There's a wonderful residence on the other side of town. It's not what you think, not an old folks' home, but more like a resort with nurses on call, 3 meals a day, and plenty of people to socialize with. They even have painting classes and a small library. We thought you could try it out just for a little while to see if you like it." Her words were coated in sweetness, but beneath them I detected the firmness of a plan already in motion. Craig cleared his throat and added, "It's practical, Samuel. You wouldn't have to worry about upkeep bills or emergencies. You deserve to relax." The way he said the word practical made me feel as if I were a broken appliance being replaced rather than a man being offered comfort. I tried to laugh it off, saying that I was fine where I was, that the house may be old, but it was mine, and that I preferred my solitude to forced activities. Eleanor pressed on with a practiced smile. "Just a trial stay, Dad. 2 weeks at most. Think of it as a vacation, and if you don't like it, you can come back. We've already arranged everything." That last phrase cut through me like ice. Already arranged. I asked her what exactly she meant, and she replied quickly, "We made a reservation. We thought it would be easier for you not to worry about the details. They're expecting you tomorrow morning." Craig finally looked up from his phone, nodding as if to close the matter. "It's settled, Samuel. Pack a small bag, just your essentials. They provide everything else." I sat there staring at them, my hands trembling slightly, though I tried to keep them still against the table. The decision was not mine, though they disguised it as kindness. I wanted to argue, to demand why they thought they could dictate my life, but the words lodged in my throat because I realized they had already decided that resistance from me would only confirm their belief that I was incapable. After a long silence, I asked what would happen to the house while I was gone, and Craig replied smoothly, "We'll keep an eye on it. It's better this way. Less for you to worry about." His tone suggested ownership already, as if the house had slipped from my grasp into their hands with nothing more than a signature I had not yet given. That night I barely slept. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, remembering all the times Marjorie and I had spoken about growing old together in this house, about the garden we would keep until our hands could no longer hold the tools, about sitting on the porch with coffee while the seasons passed. To think that my daughter would dismiss all of that with a phrase like change of scenery filled me with a quiet despair that felt heavier than anger. In the morning, when they arrived with the car, I climbed in without protest, carrying a small suitcase, though every step felt like surrender. The drive was long enough for me to watch familiar streets give way to newer developments, sleek and cold, and then to the outskirts where the building rose like a hotel, all glass and polished brick, the sign reading Willow Acres Residential Living. Eleanor spoke brightly as we pulled in, pointing out the flower beds at the entrance and the fountain that gurgled mechanically in the courtyard. But to me it looked like a place designed not for living, but for keeping people contained. Inside, the lobby smelled of disinfectant mixed with artificial lavender, a smell too sharp to disguise its true purpose. A receptionist greeted us with a rehearsed smile, sliding a clipboard toward me with forms to sign. "Just routine paperwork," Eleanor assured, placing a pen in my hand before I had even read the first line. My eyesight faltered on the fine print, and I asked what it said. She laughed lightly, as though my question were unnecessary. "Just consent forms, Dad. Nothing serious." Craig leaned over me, tapping the spot where my signature was required, and though my stomach twisted, I signed because refusing would have made me appear obstinate. I saw them both watching me closely, like teachers observing a student who might fail a simple task, and in that moment I realized the balance of power had shifted. After the papers were handed over, a nurse appeared, cheerful but distant, and began to explain the routines. Breakfast at 8, lunch at noon, dinner at 6, medications provided by staff, visitors allowed on weekends, personal phones discouraged. For the sake of community interaction, Eleanor nodded approvingly at each rule, while I stood silent, feeling the net close around me. When they showed me to a room, small and impersonal, with twin beds and a narrow window facing the parking lot, I placed my suitcase on the chair and tried to smile. "It's temporary," Eleanor whispered, kissing my cheek. "Just give it a chance." But when she left with Craig, waving casually, as though dropping off a child at camp, I felt the full weight of the truth. I had not been offered a choice. I had been delivered. That evening, I sat on the edge of the bed while my roommate, an old man with sunken eyes and trembling hands, whispered that his son had promised him the same thing, a short stay, just to rest. But that had been 3 years ago. His voice cracked as he said, "Once they bring you here, they don't intend to take you back." I felt the words sink into my chest like stones, and though I told myself that my daughter would never go that far, that surely she meant only a brief arrangement, a part of me knew he was right. The door clicked shut behind the nurse making rounds, and the sound echoed like a lock turning on a cage. The first days at Willow Acres passed with the kind of suffocating order that pretends to be care, but is in fact control. And though I told myself that it was only temporary, each hour deepened the sense that I had stepped into a place where my voice no longer carried weight. On the very first morning, a nurse entered the room before sunrise, speaking loudly as though we were children to be woken for school, and placed a small paper cup with pills in my hand. I asked what they were, because I take only one prescribed medication for my blood pressure, and she replied with a gentle firmness that brooked no argument. "Just your regular dose, dear, all approved by the doctor." When I insisted on seeing the names, she smiled in a way that suggested amusement rather than respect, and told me that it was easier if I trusted them. My roommate swallowed his cupful without hesitation, his hands shaking, and I felt the pressure of expectation pressing on me until I, too, gave in, tasting the bitter chalk of unfamiliar pills as they slid down my throat. Meals were served at long communal tables in the dining halls where everyone sat in identical chairs, plastic cutlery clinking against the plates, and though the food was warm, it was portioned in ways that reminded me of school cafeterias. When I asked for a second helping of potatoes, the attendant shook her head with a smile too tight to be sincere and said, "We have to watch your diet." I wanted to argue that I had managed my meals well enough for decades, but around me I saw the others lowering their eyes, accustomed to being told no, and I realized that speaking up would only mark me as difficult. That word, difficult, echoed in my mind, because it was the label I feared my daughter had already placed on me, the excuse she might use to justify leaving me here longer than she had promised. Days followed a rigid schedule. Breakfast, a so-called activity session where we were expected to glue colored paper into shapes or follow along with a trivia game, then lunch, a mandated rest period, and in the afternoon, another round of community engagement. I tried once to skip one of these sessions, telling the staff I preferred to read in my room, but within minutes a nurse arrived with a clipboard, reminding me that participation was mandatory and that isolation was not healthy. She guided me by the elbow with the firmness of someone accustomed to compliance, and when I resisted, she lowered her voice and whispered, "If you don't cooperate, it will be noted in your file, and your family will be informed." The implication was clear. My daughter would be told that I was unmanageable, and the thought of giving her further justification to extend my stay silenced me. It was in those first weeks that the subtle humiliations accumulated, each one small enough to be excused if taken alone, yet together, forming a weight that pressed heavily on my spirit. They removed my wallet on the first evening, explaining that valuables were better kept in the office for safekeeping, and though they gave me a claim ticket as if I had checked a coat, I never saw it again. My phone, too, was taken with the explanation that it interfered with community bonding, and when I asked to make a call to Eleanor, the receptionist smiled and said she would pass on a message. Days later, Eleanor appeared for a brief visit, cheerful and hurried, assuring me that everything was fine at the house, that she was only keeping it tidy in my absence, but she did not return the phone or mention when I might come home. When I asked directly whether the 2 weeks were nearly up, she placed her hand over mine and said, "Dad, let's not rush. You're doing so well here. It's good for you." Her words, delivered with that peculiar mixture of affection and finality, left me feeling like a child excused from a question he was not meant to ask. At night in the shared room, I listened to my roommate whispering through the dark. He told me that his daughter had once promised the same short stay, a trial, and that now his mail was redirected here, his bank card managed by someone else, and his old house sold. His voice trembled as he said, "They make you look confused, they write things down in the file, and soon the world believes them, not you." I wanted to tell him that my Eleanor would never go that far, that she was only being cautious, but the conviction in his tired voice unsettled me. The first real crack in my trust appeared when I noticed the way staff spoke about me, not to me, but over me, as though I were invisible. During one mealtime, I overheard 2 aides standing near the table, one saying, "He's still resistant, doesn't follow the routine well," while the other replied, "Don't worry, it'll be documented. The daughter already signed the preliminary request for guardianship." The words jolted me like a slap. Though I pretended not to hear, chewing slowly on the overcooked chicken, my heart racing. Guardianship was not a word thrown about casually. It meant control. It meant legal authority to decide where I lived, how I spent my money, what treatment I received. I wondered if I had misheard, if exhaustion was twisting their words, but the certainty in their tone lingered. When I finally confronted one of the nurses, asking directly whether such papers existed, she gave me a smile so rehearsed it was almost theatrical and said, "Mr. Keaton, you must be mistaken. Everything here is for your own safety." That phrase, "for your own safety," echoed in my head for hours. Safety had become a weapon, an argument against freedom, and every time it was uttered, it stripped away a fragment of my dignity. The pattern grew clearer with each day. Restrictions justified by health, condescension disguised as affection, silence from my daughter whenever I pressed for details. My letters to Nicholas and Grace, written in longhand and left at the reception desk with the hope that they would be mailed, were never acknowledged, and I began to suspect they were never sent at all. Once, when I asked about them, the receptionist glanced down at her screen and muttered that young people were busy, that I should not expect too much. The most wounding moment came one afternoon when Eleanor visited with Craig. We sat in the lounge where a television blared a game show none of us watched, and as I tried to explain that I wanted to return home, Craig interrupted with a chuckle, saying, "Dad, don't you remember? You agreed to stay longer because it was easier for everyone." Eleanor nodded solemnly, adding, "You must have forgotten, but that's all right. We understand." I knew with painful clarity that I had never agreed to such a thing, but to protest would only reinforce the narrative they were crafting. that I was confused, forgetful, no longer reliable. I swallowed my anger, but inside me, something hardened. The first seed of realization that this was not a mistake or an overcautious arrangement. It was a design. When they left that day, I walked slowly back to my room, each step heavy with the knowledge that my autonomy was dissolving not through overt force, but through 1,000 quiet cuts, the withholding of choices, the rewriting of my words, the subtle gaslighting that made me doubt my own memory. I lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, hearing my roommate's whispered warning repeat in my head. It was then, in the quiet hum of the fluorescent light, that I admitted to myself that I was no longer merely staying in a nursing home for rest. I was being prepared for a transfer of control, piece by piece, signature by signature, until the life I had built would belong to others. It was in the third week of my stay that the illusion of temporary arrangements collapsed completely, and what I had suspected in shadows came into the light with a clarity that left no more room for doubt. Until then, I had been surviving day by day, swallowing their pills, attending their trivial activities, waiting for the moment Eleanor would appear and say, "Pack your bag, Dad, let's go home." But instead, she had grown more distant. Her visits shorter, her words softer, but more final, like a nurse soothing a patient before a painful procedure. One afternoon, restless and unable to sit through another hollow community discussion, I wandered down a corridor that I had not walked before. The halls of Willow Acres were lined with cheerful posters of smiling seniors holding paintbrushes or walking in gardens, yet behind those images there was always the antiseptic smell, the sense of locked doors, the quiet footfalls of staff who appeared whenever one lingered too long. At the far end of the corridor, I noticed a door left ajar. The office of the facility director, a heavy-set man named Mr. Holloway, whom I had seen only briefly during orientation. Curiosity, or perhaps desperation, guided my steps closer, and when I heard no voices inside, I slipped through the opening, just far enough to see the papers spread across his desk. What caught my eye first was not my name, but the familiar block lettering of Eleanor's, neat and precise, on a document stamped with the seal of the county court. I moved closer, heart pounding in my ears, and there it was in black ink, a petition for guardianship listing me as mentally impaired, unable to manage finances or personal care. Beneath her name was Craig's, signed as a supporting witness, attesting to episodes of confusion, aggression, and memory lapses. My knees nearly gave way beneath me, because though I had feared something of this nature, seeing it in official print turned dread into reality. I scanned further and saw attached statements from the staff, notes describing incidents that had never occurred. Patient refused to bathe, claimed the year was 1985, one note said. Another described me wandering the halls at night, unable to recognize location. A third claimed I had attempted to take someone else's medication. Each one was a fabrication, a lie carefully written in the kind of clinical language that convinces judges. I stood there trembling, realizing that every smile, every gentle pat on the arm had been accompanied by the quiet scratch of pens against paper, documenting me into incapacity. On the corner of the desk lay a folder, slightly open, revealing copies of my bank statements, property records, and even my insurance policy. How they had obtained these, I could not imagine, though Craig's career in finance gave me a grim clue. There was also a valuation of my house, highlighted in bright ink, with figures circled and notes in the margin about potential sale value. The implication was undeniable. This was not about my health. It was about what could be taken once my signature was dismissed as worthless. My life had been translated into numbers and assets, and the process was already in motion to transfer them into my daughter's hands. As I stood frozen, I heard footsteps in the hall and quickly pulled away, retreating to the shadows of my room before anyone could catch me. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, that perhaps these were precautions never meant to be enacted, but the evidence was too clear. The guardianship petition bore dates within days, meaning the court would soon decide my fate without ever hearing my voice. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible, because it was not merely neglect or indifference, but active conspiracy, the deliberate rewriting of my existence by my own daughter and the man she married. That evening, I tried to speak to Eleanor when she arrived, showing her the tremor in my hands as I described what I had seen. But she silenced me with the patience of someone indulging a child. "Dad, you must have been confused. You're under stress here. You know you can't just wander into offices and misinterpret documents," Craig added with a chuckle. "That's exactly what we're worried about. Your memory playing tricks on you." Their performance was flawless, their tones gentle, yet their eyes betrayed a cold certainty. They knew I had seen the truth, and they were already twisting it into evidence against me. That night, long after the lights dimmed and the halls fell silent, I lay awake, listening to the mechanical hum of the ventilation system and the restless breathing of my roommate. The realization pressed on me with crushing force. If I did nothing, within weeks, I would be declared legally incompetent, my home sold, my savings transferred, and my freedom gone forever. The clock was ticking not in seconds, but in court dates and signatures, and every smile from staff, every condescending phrase of "for your safety," was another nail in the coffin of my autonomy. For the first time in my life, I felt not simply old, but imprisoned. A man still in possession of his mind, but trapped in a world determined to erase it. It was there, in that sleepless darkness, that fear transformed into resolve. If they wished to paint me as helpless, then my only chance was to prove otherwise, to find a way to outwit the very system that had been built to contain men like me. I did not yet know how, but the knowledge of their betrayal had shifted something inside me. No longer could I wait passively for Eleanor's promises. No longer could I believe in the kindness of their voices. The midpoint of my captivity had revealed the full scale of the plot, and from that moment forward, my every thought turned toward escape, not only to reclaim my freedom, but to expose the secrets they believed would remain hidden behind the locked doors of Willow Acres. I learned very quickly that at Willow Acres, punishment rarely looked like punishment. It looked like kindness sharpened into a blade. In the second week, after I'd found the petition papers on the director's desk, that blade began to press against my throat from several directions at once, because the moment I asked cautious questions about my file, the staff became smiling gatekeepers who noted everything, who reminded me that participation was so helpful for your well-being, who moved my pill time earlier by 15 minutes and then by 30, who replaced my roommate without warning, explaining that Mr. Daniels had transitioned to a higher support wing, a phrase that sounded benign, until I saw him the next day being wheeled past with a slack mouth and a string of drool, his hands tied loosely under a blanket in the way they do when they want to. Pretend restraint is comfort, and I understood that the higher support wing was not a place you graduated from, but a place you disappeared into when your protests grew too coherent. I stopped sleeping easily after that and began to count footsteps and keys in the hall at night, measuring which aide lingered by which door, which cart carried which forms, because if they were building a case in the shadows, then I would build my defense in the same darkness. And I started with the only currency left to me, the careful attention of a man who sorted mail for 38 years and can still read patterns better than most men read faces. On a Tuesday after lunch, while the lounge erupted into a forced sing-along led by a cheerful activities director who did not know more than 3 chords on the guitar, I excused myself for the restroom and took the long way back, slipping into the little chapel at the end of the corridor where no one ever prayed except me and a frail woman who mouthed hymns without sound. And behind the donation box there was a janitor's closet with a door that didn't always latch. I had noticed the night custodian, a quiet man with tired eyes named Ernesto, pausing there on his rounds. And that night when he found me sitting in the dark pews, he didn't startle. He just asked softly whether I needed anything, and I told him the truth in a single long breath, that I was being turned into a diagnosis to separate me from my house and savings, that the papers existed, that the notes were lies, and that if there was any way for a man in my position to make a copy of a page, I would be grateful for the chance. He looked at me a long time, weighing whether I was merely an agitated old man, then nodded once and said he would think. And 2 nights later he left a small roll of masking tape and a narrow flashlight beneath the cushion of the chapel's front pew, and said without meeting my eyes that the copier in the business office was left on standby after 10, and that the hall camera by the nurse's station had a blind corner where the ceiling light had failed, and if I wanted to be foolish, I should at least be precise. Precision had been my pride, so I planned as if my life depended on it, because it did. I watched the medication cart routes and learned the rhythms of the late shift. I timed the patrols and listened for the elevator chime. That meant an aide was delivering linens, and when the building slipped into the heavy quiet that arrives just after midnight, I slid from my bed, put the flashlight in my sock, taped a small pocket notebook flat against my thigh, and walked with an old man's shuffle to the chapel, pausing whenever I heard a shoe scuff or a cough, keeping my face loose and amiable in case anyone glanced up. The business office door had a keypad lock, but, as Ernesto had predicted, it had not latched. Inside, The copier gleamed like a foolish lighthouse, and the desk lamp left a clean circle of light on a stack of files with colored tabs, where, as if the director trusted his kingdom to stacks and staples, I found a folder labeled with my name, and beneath it 4 more with names I recognized from the dining hall. And when I opened mine, my stomach clenched in a dry cramp, because the pages were thick, with entries written in the tidy, slanted hand of Nurse Albright, documenting fantasies as if they were observations, while clipped to the back were photocopies of my bank statements and a printout of an email chain between Mr. Holloway and my daughter discussing timelines and petition success rates, and a facilitation fee that would be deducted from an initial transfer once guardianship was granted. Language so coldly administrative that for a moment I forgot to breathe. I copied what I could in the minutes I dared spend, the petition draft with its list of supposed episodes, the email where Craig promised to expedite an appraisal, a ledger page that made my hands shake because on it, in the same column as my name, were several dates and dollar amounts labeled placement bonus, and next to those numbers, in parentheses, the surnames of sons and daughters whose smiles I had seen in the lounge on visiting days, and it became sickeningly clear that Willow Acres did not merely accept the helpless, it cultivated helplessness as a line of revenue, and shared the harvest with families who were happy to call theft a care plan. I folded the warm copies into the waistband of my pajama pants and slid back through the dim hall with my old man's shuffle. But when I turned the final corner, I heard the squeak of rubber soles and the murmur of voices and realized that a night nurse and an aide were at the desk reviewing charts, and I had one chance to avoid being discovered out of bounds with contraband. So I let my knees soften and collapsed slowly against the wall, groaning and calling out that I felt faint. And in the flurry that followed, with the blood pressure cuff and the cold stethoscope and the cluck of concern, no one thought to pat down the waistband of a sleepy man's pajamas. The next morning brought a new blow, dressed as routine, a visit from a doctor I had never met, a man with an elegant pen and a cologne that smelled like mint trying to smother bleach, who introduced himself as Dr. Kensley and proceeded to conduct a cognitive exam with the genial air of a kindly uncle, asking me to draw a clock and name animals and subtract sevens from 100 while he watched not my answers but my hesitation. And every time I answered, quickly he would say, "Take your time, Mr. Keaton." Accuracy over speed, which slowed me enough to look less crisp on his form. Afterward, he patted my shoulder and told the nurse, just loudly enough for me to hear, that I showed clear signs of sundowning and executive dysfunction, and I understood that the test had not been designed to measure my mind, but to frame it. I asked for a copy of his notes, and he smiled indulgently and said copies were for families, not residents, then mentioned the Maple Wing with its quiet rooms and extra attention and locked doors, and I thought of Mr. Daniel's slack mouth and told myself that no matter how sharply they wrote, no matter how sincerely they lied, I would not be wheeled behind those doors. It is a strange thing to feel hunted while moving at the speed of an old man, to feel urgency burn in the same body that insists upon slowness. But my life had become a series of small races against a paperwork machine, so I hid the copies inside my Bible. No one checks the old man's Bible. And as a further precaution, I slipped the ledger page into the thin cardboard backing of my framed photograph of Marjorie, which hung at my bedside, where it looked like nothing more than an old man's private shrine. I wrote a letter by hand to an attorney I had known years ago when we refinanced the house, a patient man named Harold Buckley, who had once told me that paper can be a weapon, but also a shield. And because I had no stamps and no access to outgoing mail that wasn't screened, I asked Ernesto for one more reckless favor, which he granted without a word, tucking my envelope into his jacket with the same careful motion he used to carry a glass vase. In the letter, I told Harold everything: the petition, the doctor's performance, the ledger of bonuses, and I wrote not with outrage, but with the sort of crisp detail that convinces judges and persuades men who have forgotten how to be shocked. And then I waited, because waiting is what the old must perfect if we are to survive the plans of the young. The facility struck back in small ways, designed to look like guardianship of my health. My pill cup grew heavier. My afternoon nap was encouraged. My walk in the courtyard was shortened because the air was too brisk, and a new note appeared by my doctor reminding staff that I have a tendency to perseverate on delusional themes regarding finances, a sentence exquisite in its cruelty because it anticipated the truth and labeled it madness before it reached any ears. When Eleanor visited, she brought a plastic container of cut fruit and a smile that trembled at the edges, and when I began to describe the documents, I had seen her eyes flicked to the cameras, and she pressed my hand as if to comfort me, while whispering that stress can do strange things to memory at my age, that I should trust the professionals, that we all wanted what was best for me. And I answered her with the gentleness of a man who has just heard a weather forecast for a storm that has already arrived. Craig, as always, was more direct. And when Eleanor stepped away to take a call, he leaned close and said in a low voice that fighting this would only make things worse, that I would paint myself as unstable, that cooperation would ensure comfort. And when I asked him, in the same low voice, whether the word bonus meant comfort to him, he blinked once and smiled in a way that told me I had not misunderstood a thing. If there was any moment that forced me past caution into risk, it was the afternoon I discovered that my granddaughter Grace had stood at the front desk and been turned away. I did not learn it from staff, who told me blandly that no one had asked for me, but from a small envelope that I found in the shred bin beside the copier during one of my nervous late-night passes. A pretty envelope with a flower printed on the corner, addressed in a hand I remembered from birthday cards, and inside was a letter folded around a single photograph of her with Nicholas at Thanksgiving, both smiling. And in the letter she wrote that Mom had said I needed rest, that she wanted to see me, but had been told visits upset me, and she added a phone number with the note that if I felt up to calling, she would pick up any time, and that small mercy of being remembered filled my eyes. But it also told me that the story being told about me had exceeded even Eleanor's need for comfort, and had been weaponized into a lie that barred the only two people who might have noticed the cage being welded around me. I copied the letter, returned the original to my Bible, and understood that I now had two kinds of proof: the financial incentive and the human suppression, and that, together, they made a story even the polite might call ugly. The staff must have sensed the tightening of my will, because the next day, Nurse Albright arrived with an apologetic nod and an order for a new medication to help me settle, and the pill was larger and chalkier, and after I swallowed it, a warm fog came up through my limbs and pooled behind my eyes, and for hours I moved, as if the floor had tilted, my tongue heavy, my thoughts drifting just out of reach. And when I woke after dinner, with a wool blanket tucked under my chin, I realized that if they could not discredit my words, they would dim them at the source. And that night I did not go to the copier. I did not meet Ernesto. I lay awake and let the fog thin until my mind returned. And then I hid the new pill beneath my tongue and spat it into a tissue when the nurse left. And I began to keep those tissues in the lining of my shoe as insurance against the claim that I had complied and calmed, a small cache of proof that I had been more alert than they wished. What I had not anticipated was the speed with which the legal machinery would grind forward. 3 days after Harold received my letter, later he told me he had left his office mid-afternoon to drive straight to my town. The old stubborn man who still believes in errands done in person, Mr. Holloway summoned me to his office with a look of paternal concern and explained that a court visitor would be assessing me on Friday, that it was nothing to worry about, that the visitor was there to support residents, and he slid across the desk a fresh copy of the petition as if showing me a brochure for a bus tour, and I replied as evenly as I could that I welcomed an impartial ear and that I hoped the visitor would enjoy copies of the facility's internal ledger, at which point his eyes lifted in a fleeting flinch that told me he had not imagined an old man might own a mirror to his paperwork. He softened his voice and mentioned again the maple wing, and I answered wearily that I had no plans to travel. 2 things then happened in quick succession that turned my private resistance into a public risk. First, Harold arrived in the lobby at 10 in the morning with the clean fury of a man who has read enough to act, asking to see me as my counsel, and the receptionist, unprepared for an attorney instead of a worried child, tried to argue policy, which Harold countered by asking whether they wished to explain to a judge why a resident was denied legal access during a guardianship proceeding. Second, as if some inner alarm demanded retaliation, Mr. Holloway ordered a behavioral hold after I declined my afternoon medication, and 2 aides escorted me to the medical room, where a nurse prepared an injection, and only the sudden appearance of Harold in the doorway, speaking politely but firmly about consent and records and court orders, disrupted the little scene, and in the pause that followed, I saw clearly how thin the line was between an old man's autonomy and a syringe. The hold was withdrawn with apologetic murmurs. The nurse's smile returned to neutral, and Harold, without moving his eyes from the staff, asked me in a steady voice whether I felt able to sign a limited power of attorney for the sole purpose of defense against a guardianship petition. My hand shook not from weakness, but from the gravity of the moment, and I signed. And when he placed his briefcase on his knee, I heard the faint clink of glass as if a door had opened to air. By nightfall, the balance had shifted, but the danger had doubled. Because while Harold had secured a temporary stay pending the court visitor's assessment and requested copies of my medical notes, the staff responded by tightening routines until each hour felt like a test, and Mr. Daniels did not reappear, and neither did the woman who mouthed hymns in the chapel. And the maple wing seemed to throb like a heart you pretend not to hear when you lie awake. I understood then that exposure would require more than documents. It would require a crack that let daylight in, and daylight would not penetrate while I remained a cooperative resident behind a receptionist's smile. So the second escalation was not only the gathering of proof, but the acceptance that escape itself would be part of the evidence. Because a man labeled incompetent who navigates his way out of a locked routine to a hospital or a police station becomes a contradiction the paperwork cannot easily swallow. I began to work backward from that truth, tracing routes in my head between doors and elevators and service exits, memorizing the timing of meal carts and the precise minutes the night crew loaded laundry. And I asked Ernesto a final favor I knew could cost him his job, which he granted with a sigh that sounded like prayer, handing me a small visitor's badge on a retractable clip, the kind that opens the side entrance by the dumpsters when the sensor is slow and everyone is tired, and I tucked it into the hem of my robe and told him that even if I failed, I would make noise enough to be heard. Before any of that could happen, however, I needed one more thing to harden the case into something a court visitor could not pretend was a misunderstanding, and that arrived unexpectedly when a resident's son, an accountant with a loud tie and a nervous habit of tapping his car keys against his thigh, stood at the front desk arguing about bills, his voice rising until even the television in the lounge seemed to pause. And after he left, I saw the receptionist toss a crumpled printout toward the bin and miss. And while the others busied themselves, I wandered close and picked it up and discovered a fee schedule with a column labeled Family Incentives, tiered depending on length of stay achieved before guardianship. Numbers so bald they almost looked like a parody. And at the bottom, a disclaimer in small type about independent community partnerships, which must have been their term for whoever filed the false medical notes that greased the skids. I tucked the paper under my shirt and felt, for the first time since Eleanor's cheerful invasion of my kitchen, that I had gathered enough truth to be dangerous, and that if I could move my body through one door at the right hour, I might yet make it to a kind of morning. The night before the court visitor was scheduled to assess me, I understood that waiting passively would mean the end of everything. The documents I had copied, the letter I had sent to Harold, even the cache of unswallowed pills hidden in my shoe, all of that would mean nothing if I were quietly shifted into the maple wing and silenced. I had watched too many men vanish that way, replaced by new faces at the dining tables, their names erased in a matter of weeks, as if they had never existed. My escape plan, crude and desperate, had sharpened into necessity, and though my body trembled with age, my mind had never been clearer. I would walk out of Willow Acres before dawn and put the evidence in the hands of someone who could not ignore it. Ernesto's badge felt like a talisman in my palm as I sat in the chapel, whispering prayers I was not sure I believed, waiting for the moment when the shift changed, and the halls grew loose with fatigue. At 2 a.m, I rose, straightened my robe, and walked with the slow shuffle of an old man who could not possibly be plotting rebellion. The nurse at the desk glanced up, saw nothing alarming, and returned to her paperwork. I turned the corner, pressed the badge against the side entrance, and when the lock released, with a quiet click, my heart surged with a freedom I had not felt in years. The night air hit my face like a baptism, cold, bracing, and alive with the smell of cut grass and damp asphalt. The facility loomed behind me like a prison, its windows glowing in a grid of artificial light. And for a moment I feared an alarm would sound, that guards would pour out to drag me back. But the silence held, broken only by the faint buzz of insects and the distant hum of the highway. I moved quickly, faster than I thought possible, crossing the parking lot and slipping behind the dumpsters, where Ernesto had told me the cameras did not reach. My knees screamed with each step, but I pushed forward, clutching the Bible against my chest, where the documents lay hidden. Every shadow seemed like a threat, every gust of wind like a warning, yet the thought of surrendering was unthinkable. I had mapped the route dozens of times in my head, across the service road, through the thin strip of trees, and out onto the main avenue where buses still ran at night. I would take one into town, find Harold's office, and wait on his doorstep until dawn. But as I stumbled out onto the avenue, the headlights of a car washed over me, blinding and sudden, and I froze like a deer. The vehicle slowed, stopped, and the window rolled down. Craig's face appeared, smug even in shadow, with Eleanor beside him, her expression tight, with something between fury and fear. My blood turned to ice. They had come for me. "Dad," Eleanor called softly, as if coaxing a child. "What are you doing out here? You'll catch your death of cold." I clutched the Bible tighter. "You're not taking me back." Craig stepped out of the car, his smile a mask of reason. "You're confused. Come on, let's get you inside before anyone notices." "You don't want to make a scene, do you?" For a moment I thought of surrendering, of slipping back into the warmth of control. But then I remembered the ledger page with its columns of names, the letter from Grace hidden in my Bible, and the humiliating notes that called me delusional. Something inside me hardened. I stepped backward, shaking my head, and raised my voice for the first time in years. "Help! Somebody help me!" The sound startled even me, loud and desperate, cutting through the quiet avenue. A taxi turning the corner slowed, the driver craning his neck, and Craig cursed under his breath. Eleanor hissed, "Stop it, Dad. You're embarrassing yourself." But I kept shouting louder each time, until the taxi pulled over and the driver climbed out, suspicious eyes flicking between us. "You okay, sir?" he asked. And in that instant, I made the choice that would define the rest of my life. I thrust the Bible into his hands. "Take this. Inside are papers. They're proof. Please get them to a lawyer named Harold Buckley. His office is on Main Street." Craig lunged toward me, but the driver stepped between us, raising his hands. "Hey, relax. He said he doesn't want to go with you." Eleanor's voice trembled now, sharp with panic. "He's sick. He doesn't know what he's saying, but the driver shook his head. Doesn't look sick to me. Looks scared. In that charged moment, everything cracked open. Eleanor pleading, Craig calculating, the taxi driver gripping the Bible like it was a weapon, and me standing on the edge of the road, shaking, but unbroken. I realized then that the power my daughter and her husband held over me had always depended on silence, on my compliance, and by screaming into the night, I had already broken their spell. Even if they dragged me back now, the evidence was moving beyond their reach. The wail of sirens split the air, summoned by someone who had heard my cries. Blue lights flashed against the trees as a patrol car pulled up. Craig stepped back, his smile vanishing, while Eleanor began to cry in earnest. 2 officers got out, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. One of them asked me directly, "Sir, are you in danger?" I steadied my breathing, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and answered with a clarity that surprised even me. "Yes, from my own family." And with those words, the tide turned. The officers separated us with the gentle firmness of people who have seen family love turn into something less noble. And while one asked Eleanor and Craig for identification and listened to their overlapping explanations about stress and forgetfulness and late-night wandering, the other guided me into the back seat of the patrol car, not to lock me in, but to let me sit, to breathe, to speak without being stared down. I told him everything in a single long current. How the residents had taken my phone and wallet for safekeeping. How a doctor I had never met had turned a simple clock drawing into a diagnosis. How a folder on the director's desk contained a guardianship petition bearing my daughter's neat signature. How the ledger recorded placement bonuses alongside the names of sons and daughters who smiled on visiting days, and how a janitor named Ernesto had watched men disappear into the maple wing and could no longer keep quiet. The officer did not argue or placate. He only asked where the papers were, and I pointed at the taxi idling behind us, while the driver held my Bible to his chest like a choir book, and the officer took the book carefully, slid the copies back inside, after a quick look, and said we were going to the hospital, not the residence, because a doctor without a financial stake would be the one to make the next note in any file bearing my name. In the emergency room, I repeated my story with steadier breath, and the hospitalist, a woman with kind eyes who had no contract with Willow Acres, evaluated me the old-fashioned way: conversation, orientation, a gentle but thorough inventory of my history. She wrote that I was lucid, that I showed no signs of dementia, that I knew the date, the president, my address, the names of my grandchildren, and the difference between protection and captivity. She signed the note and handed a copy to the officer, who called Adult Protective Services and then Harold, who arrived before dawn with his tie askew and the look of a man who had driven through the night because sleep could wait, but paperwork could not. By noon, he had filed an emergency motion for a protective order preventing my return to Willow Acres, and a request for the court visitor to meet me at the hospital under neutral supervision. By evening, he had walked a detective through the copies I had smuggled out, including the email chain that no one would be able to explain as a misunderstanding. And by the time the sun dropped behind the hospital's parking lot lights, Mr. Holloway's confident baritone on the reception line had shifted into terse denials, given through counsel, while Nurse Albright called in sick, and the family incentives page disappeared from the billing system, but not from the printer tray where I had found it. The hearing a week later did not feel like vindication so much as a long exhale after a season of breath-holding. The court visitor spoke first, describing his interview with me at the hospital, and the hospitalist's independent note. Harold spoke next, laying out the timeline and dropping each exhibit into the record with the calm of a man who knows that truth becomes heavier when placed on the table in public. I spoke last, not as a lawyer, but as a father, telling the judge that I would not ask the court to punish my daughter, only to protect me from the erosion of my voice, because silence is the first step of dispossession. The judge listened without impatience, read for several minutes, and then denied the petition for guardianship with prejudice, ordered an investigation into Willow Acres by the State Health Department and the Attorney General's office, and granted a narrow restraining order prohibiting Eleanor and Craig from controlling my communications or finances. In the weeks that followed, the residence paused its cheerful advertisements. Mr. Holloway was placed on administrative leave and then arrested on a charge with more words than mercy, and Nurse Albright surrendered her license while promising to cooperate. Ernesto sat across from me in a diner and asked if he had done the right thing, and I told him that some men live their whole lives without ever being certain, but he could eat his eggs knowing he had chosen daylight over the tidy comfort of shadows. A reporter from the local paper called after the filings became public and asked for a quote, and I kept it brief because I am not a man for speeches. I said I had been treated like a policy instead of a person, that the price of safety should never be the loss of one's name, and that the door that keeps an old man from falling should not also keep him from walking. Grace visited me at the hospital with timid steps and fierce eyes and brought Nicholas 2 days later, and the three of us sat with styrofoam cups of coffee while I told them what had happened, leaving out nothing and demanding nothing. And when Grace cried, she did not cry like a child, but like a woman who has realized a silence she accepted was a silence that cost someone else his freedom. Eleanor did not come that week or the next. She called Harold instead and then called me, and our conversation went on for nearly an hour without raising our voices, because there is a kind of exhaustion that takes the drama out of even the worst confrontations, and she said that Craig had handled the paperwork, and she had trusted him, that she had believed the staff because it was easier than believing that her father still knew his own mind, and that she was sorry in the way people are. Sorry when they finally see the face of what convenience has made them capable of. I told her I did not know when or whether the thread between us could be mended, that forgiveness is an act and not a phrase, that she would need to make choices without kickbacks or shortcuts, and that for now the most loving thing we could do each other was not to pretend. I left the hospital by the front doors, not in a wheelchair, but walking, and moved into a small apartment over a shop near the library, the kind of place a retired postman can navigate without a map. Harold set up a modest trust with me as my own trustee and a professional as the backup. Not because I doubted myself, but because it is good to put a lock on the gate you intend to guard. And he helped me draft a new advance directive that said with absolute clarity that "for my safety" was never to be used as a synonym for "without my consent." On Sundays, I sit 3 pews from the back again, and on Tuesdays, I volunteer at the little postal museum 2 towns over, explaining to 4th graders how a letter finds its way home and how a trained eye can tell the difference between a smear made by rain and one made by a careless hand. Once a week, Grace meets me at the diner that does not pretend to be anything but mortal. We order the special, and we talk about her classes and about nothing at all, which is sometimes the purest form of love because it asks for no accounting. I write letters now that I send to myself, a habit that would have embarrassed me when I was young, but that cheers me in old age. I write the day plainly, and I write what I know, that the clock in my kitchen ticks without hurry, that the maple outside my window drops gold as if it has a bank that cannot be emptied, that rooms are only cages when the keys belong to someone else, and that a man can be locked away for fun only by people who have forgotten what fun is, mistaking power for amusement and paperwork for care. I keep the clippings from the investigation in a folder, not because I crave the spectacle of other people's shame, but because sometimes when the evening tilts toward doubt, it helps to see the record of what was true, written by hands that once wrote the wrong things, and I remind myself that I did not escape to become a crusader, only to live the days I have left with my name intact. When I make coffee in the morning, I hear the clock steady itself, and I think of doors opening, and of the taxi driver who held a stranger's Bible like a promise, and I say a small prayer, without asking for anything, a prayer of plain thanks that the secrets they counted on staying buried now live in files stamped with the state seal, that the men and women still at Willow Acres are being seen with eyes that notice, and that whatever time remains to me will be mine to spend on walks and letters in the ordinary holiness of being allowed to choose when to turn out the light.